Welcome to Military History Inside Out at warscholar.org, the place for military history interviews. Today's interview covers a book about World War II history. Thank you for watching. I'm speaking with David P. Colley, author of The Folly of Generals, How Eisenhower's Broad Front Strategy Lengthened World War II, published by Casemate March 31st, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first, I noticed you've written a few books before on World War II. Can you tell me how you got started in studying this subject and writing on it?
Well, I grew up in the aftermath of World War II in the late 40s, early 50s, and I remember the veterans coming back, and of course at that time they were all in their 20s. But even then, one of the things that I always remember was the Red Ball Express, and I can't remember exactly why. And you'd see Red Ball. There was a Red Ball trucking company in Indiana. And through the years, I always kind of collected information about the Red Ball Express. And then finally, in the 1990s, I've been a freelance writer for some time. I decided that, take the information that you've collected and send it out as a book. So I worked on a book on the Red Ball Express. It had never been written about before, other than in occasional magazine articles. And so that started me on the process of writing about World War II. I got to know a lot of the vets. These guys in the Red Ball were all black. Well, many of them, about 80% were black. And so I got to know them, and I got to know white drivers. And from there, I learned from the blacks that there was the black infantry volunteers at the end of the war. The army obviously was segregated. White divisions wouldn't take black troops, but because of manpower problems, at the end of the war, they asked a number of black troops as service troops to volunteer for the infantry, and they got about 5,000 or 6,000. And at the time, most of these guys, or many of them, were still alive. So I was able to interview quite a few of the black veterans, and that led to my book, Blood for Dignity, which is I followed a black platoon in the 99th Division. That was very interesting. And from there, I learned about General Devers and his attempt to cross the Rhine in November 1944. And I wrote, that turned into the book Decision at Strasbourg. So, and along the way, I came across a very interesting subject. There was a young flyer from Mississippi who was killed, and he was said to be the first flyer to die at Ploesti. His body was never retrieved, and his father spent about 6 years searching for his body and eventually found him. So that's kind of how I got into World War II. I knew a lot of these vets. I would go to Battle of the Bulge, veterans of the Battle of the Bulge meetings and so forth. So, one thing led to another, writing about World War II. And so that was basis, in a sense, pulling together a lot of information that I had read about, studied, that became Folly of Generals. I also did a book a couple of years ago called The Faces of War. I don't know, Seeing the War. What I did was I took a lot of the photographs from World War II, relatively famous or well-known photographs, and determined what happened to the guys in the photos. And it was a fascinating exercise. Some of the guys were killed. Most of them survived. But that was a fun project. I probably talked to about 100 different, I studied about 100 different photographs and tried to determine what happened to the guys in the photographs.
Oh, wow. That sounds really interesting. But so this book, I looked through the table of contents. I couldn't quite tell if you lay it out chronologically or do you look at different operations and battles?
Yeah. The point of the book was to show that there were numerous opportunities along the Western Front in late 44, even in summer of 44 into 1945, where the Allies, had they taken advantage of certain areas. They could have advanced, or possibly could have advanced to the Rhine and then eventually crossed the Rhine earlier than they did. They crossed the Rhine in March 45, and had they followed some of these advances earlier in the fall of 44, they might have been able to get to the Rhine. German generals confirmed this. During this time, there were at least 2 or 3 spots, areas on the Western Front from Aachen down to the Swiss frontier, where there were possibilities of a breakthrough, and they were ignored. And during this time, in September 1944, obviously, the Allies pursued the Market Garden attack in Holland, the attempt to reach the Arnhem Bridge over the Lower Rhine, and they expended thousands of tons of supplies and gallons of gasoline. About 100,000 men were involved in this. Many generals thought it was a very poor decision. The intelligence officer for the British 1st Airborne warned against it. In fact, he just died a couple of months ago. Oh. He came back and went into the UN. But that was a very poorly designed, poorly led, some people say, attack to circumvent the Siegfried Line. And so my point was that if the Allied generals had been swift enough and imaginative enough, they had the resources, they had the men, they had the reserves, that they could have bolstered some of these attack areas and expanded the area of attack and reached the Rhine. The one at Aachen, the 7th Corps made very good progress in the Stolberg corridor. Obviously, the Germans were a well-run, well-oiled army. They were very difficult to defeat, but they were always able to somehow bring in reserves. And so they brought in a German division from the Eastern Front, which basically closed down the American attack in the Stolberg corridor. And General Collins basically said that there were no reserves. At Wallendorf, which is on the Luxembourg border with Germany, the Allies made a kind of a reconnaissance in force. And they got pretty deep. They got 8 to 10 miles inside Germany. They were through the Siegfried Line, and they were called back because the Germans put up some ferocious resistance. And the question is, if there had been a reinforcement by who knows how many, maybe a couple of regiments, the German generals are very explicit about it. The Americans' 5th Corps would have reached the Rhine. There was nothing to stop them. And that follows down into Belfort in Alsace, where General Trescott wanted to immediately attack Belfort and try to trap the German 19th Army. And he was told, no, he couldn't do it. And he was furious. And he felt that the Germans in that area were so weak that the 7th Army, led by General Patch, would have had a fairly easy time. Now, this is his opinion. Maybe not an easy time, but they would have been able to breach the German defenses and roll into Alsace and surround the German 19th Army. That again was shot down. But an interesting sidelight to that, when you read about Belfort, in fact, I was just reading in one of the histories, one of the more popular histories, that the Trescott's suggestion or desire to breach the German defenses at Belfort was, quote unquote, dubious at best. Well, if you read Trescott, he didn't think it was dubious at all. He felt that, yes, there was a supply problem, but his army and his troops would rise to the occasion, particularly if you could destroy a German army. And when he was turned down, he said, okay, if I'm going to be turned down to do something that I think is worthwhile, send me back to Italy. Well, when I read that, I mean, he spells this out in a letter to General Patch. I'd be better off taking the 6th Corps, which was one of the most, if not the most experienced corps in the American Army at the time. And he said, send me to Italy. And I'm saying, why would you send 6th Corps to Italy? Well, his strategy was, you take the 6th Corps, send them into Italy in the Nice, Genoa area, and you cut off the German armies south and force them to retreat, or you can destroy the German armies in Italy. And that's a subject that has never been explored, to the best of my knowledge, what Truscott might have been able to accomplish had he done that. Of course, the year before, this several months before that, the same setup was going on when the Allied line around south of Rome pushed north, and the 6th Corps was supposed to reach out, advance out, and trap the German 14th Army, and General Clark refused or shot that possibility down. So anyway, I can't remember what the question was, but this is some of the reasoning behind this book to show that there were opportunities. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would have succeeded, but there were opportunities in which the American Army could have possibly breached the German defenses. We always think, well, Patton was going to do it. Patton ran into a lot of resistance because the Germans were packing the line in his area with some of the best troops they could find, because they were afraid of it. But there were other areas, and another aspect of this is that there were quite a few reserves that the Americans and the British had. Tens of thousands of troops that possibly could have been thrown into the fight. Now, a lot of critics would say they didn't have the resources to get these troops into action. But if you take a look at Market Garden, they had the resources if they wanted to make use of them. And there were thousands of American troops tied up in Brittany, confining the Germans there to the ports. And Patton, I think he actually expressed an interest in getting some of those troops. There were 2 divisions protecting the right flank of Patton's army on the Loire against the possibility of an attack by the 19th Army, German 19th Army, which was retreating in chaos back to Germany, and very little possibility that you needed to maintain 2 divisions along the Loire. So you had a lot of men that were available. You could have detached a number of regiments or whatever it was. And then, of course, in Britain, you had 5 airborne divisions. You had the 101st, the 82nd, you had the British 1st and the British 6th. And I believe there was one other, yes, there was the American 11th Airborne Division. That had just arrived. But you had a lot of men there and a lot of experienced soldiers. And they used them in the Battle of the Bulge when they needed them. They sent them in, and they could have done the same thing. And I think in a number of my point is that they made use of some of these troops at these various locations where they could have made a breakthrough.
And I saw that the book had, it looked like at least 15 or 20 chapters. Or does each chapter address a possible different course of action?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier chronologically. I designed it so that I start with Market Garden and this huge effort to breach the German line, and then I don't finish Market Garden. I go immediately to Wallendorf to point out that this huge effort to go around the German line, and here at Wallendorf, at the same time, the same week, 5th Corps had broken through the German defenses. And then I switch back to point out what a disaster Market Garden became. And then I go into some of the other areas, one of them being Strasbourg, Devers' attempt to cross the Rhine in November. And Eisenhower refused to allow it. And also some of these generals, and I think one of the criticisms of General Hodges was that he was trained and fought in World War I.
Hmm.
and he liked to straight up attack, hundreds or thousands of troops moving in tandem,
Hmm.
and he didn't take advantage of some of the possibilities, and Wallendorf was one of them.
Hmm. And do you think Eisenhower did he do this to sort of protect everyone in general, or what was his concern about not applying a broad front strategy?
To kind of break through. This is what he tried at
Mm.
Arnhem, and it didn't work.
Mm.
So you have the broad front strategy. Well, some of the theories, one of the theories on this is that in North Africa, uh, he met defeat at the Kasserine Pass.
Mhm.
Of course, the Americans were terribly inexperienced at that time, but he almost lost his command, or he was concerned about losing his command because the Germans broke through the American front at Kasserine Pass, and it was considered a disaster.
Mhm.
And so there are some uh, theories are that he knew the war was going to be won. That was almost a given. The Germans were falling apart. They just, one way or the other, they were going to collapse. And he didn't want to take the risk that he would have a bloody nose.
Mm.
And of course, this happened in the Bulge. And I point out that at Wallendorf, General Giraud, who was commanding the Fifth Corps, may have decided to pull back or may not have argued strongly enough to keep the attack at Wallendorf going,
Mhm.
because he was facing a congressional hearing on his role in the disaster at Pearl Harbor. He was in planning at the time of Pearl Harbor, and the question was, did he do enough to protect the American fleet?
Mhm.
And he was censured by Congress, as was General Marshall. And so he probably one of my theories is that uh, Giraud did not want to pursue an advance into Germany if he didn't have the right number of troops, because if he got burned, it would look even worse when he went before a congressional committee dealing with Pearl Harbor. He eventually was rehabilitated, took over 15th Army, and Marshall um, gave his resignation to Roosevelt, who turned it down.
Mm.
And Marshall was, I think, pretty upset at being censured by the Congress.
Mhm. How much did concerns about the fact that the U.S. would have to fight Japan after Europe was done, how much did that affect any of the planning and decisions here? Do you go into that at all?
Not really. No, I don't. I think one thing that I do know is that as the war ground on, some of these divisions were, uh, allotted to going to the Pacific. I can't remember the exact divisions, but I'm not sure whether that was a major factor. I think where it was a factor, it was probably in equipment. Uh, of course, one of the reasons why there was D-Day, June 6th, and then there was the invasion of southern France in
Mhm.
August. And one of the reasons, initially, I think the military talked about doing these simultaneously, but they didn't have enough landing craft to pull it off. And that is one area where the possibility existed, where because of the Pacific War, the European War did not get the resources that they could have used. And the same thing might be true of aircraft. When you realize the number of planes that were shot down
Mm-hmm.
thousands. And so you keep producing these planes, and some of them have to go to the Pacific along with the Navy. But I don't know of anything specific where they were concerned about the war in the Pacific. But I would imagine that at some point this probably came up. But I think in the end, in the end of 1944, there was a serious manpower shortage, and that obviously was part of the fact that we were fighting in two major areas.
Mm-hmm. So to play devil's advocate here, I'm sure some people will see this book and say, hey, we won the war in Europe. It's unfair to go back and question their decisions. How do you respond to that complaint?
Well, I'm certainly aware that that's going to happen, and I have to give Eisenhower a great deal of credit. He held together a coalition that at times was falling apart, and but I'm just trying to point out that there were these opportunities, whether they were taken or not, is somewhat debatable. I think what I'm saying is I don't think the American Army at that time had the kind of military imagination, and the training that, say, the German Army had. These guys have been fighting, wars. The American Army didn't have, except in World War I, large formations of troops. And the Germans kept making fun of the Americans in World War II, saying that these guys are still fighting Indians. They don't know how to take a formation and use it in a manner that is consistent with modern warfare. So the Germans kept, being amazed that Americans would never concentrate their attacks. They wouldn't. The Germans, one of the things the Germans would do is they would amass a formation and push it through. Americans would push through, but they didn't have the resources to keep it going. And a lot of this, I think, would probably be because of the training and the experience. And I do remember reading once where towards the very end of the war, the Germans officers, the German generals, began to realize that the Americans were now catching on. They had some great formations, and they used the men properly and went into the attack properly. So I think a lot of it was experience. But my point was what possible opportunities were there. And at the same time, this is also, it's just not a criticism of the military, it's a criticism of historical research. If you read, I've been reading military books, excuse me, for many, many years, and you come across these situations or these places like Wallendorf, and the history books say, well, they didn't have the resources to do it, to continue the attack. Well, no one that I know of has actually gone in and explored this. And you go to the German archives and you see that the German generals were deeply concerned that the Americans would break through. In fact, one of my chapters is called A Miracle in the West, when the Americans pulled back at Wallendorf, and the Germans didn't even know for a day or two that they had pulled back, and they were desperate. They were throwing in cooks and kids to try to stop the Americans, and the Americans pulled back. And one of the German generals, he's well known, and I forget his name right now, called it, and he wrote a book, I think it's called The Miracle in the West, where he talks about the Americans not pursuing attacks. And so one of my points here is that, historical research sometimes doesn't go far enough. They should be exploring. When you read about, say, Belfort and Trescott, what was Trescott really saying? And he, particularly when he said, let take me to Italy, that's never been explored. And did anybody ever explore the possibility of what would have happened had Trescott attacked in Belfort? The German generals were terrified that he would do exactly that, pointing out that they had so few defenses. They would reinforce some of their troops with a couple of tanks, And a couple of old howitzers they captured on the Russian front. They didn't have much to stop anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I am aware that, in fact, I think that's one of the points of the book, is that to generate some discussion
Mm-hmm.
About Eisenhower and his broad front, Montgomery and his, knife thrusts. And I think, generally speaking, you could say that all the generals, they had their deficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
And but Eisenhower was as much a diplomat as he was a general. And of course, this is one of the criticisms of him.
Mm-hmm.
But he pulled together that coalition and kept it going.
So this is outside the scope of your book, but do you know if the Soviets practiced a broad front strategy or did more of concentrated attacks?
I think both, but I think that it was concentrated attacks. I mean, but they had, when they attacked, they just attacked by tens of hundreds of thousands of men, and just steamrolled the Germans. And I think the most the Germans had on the Eastern Front was something like 3 million men. And the Russians had, 6, 7, 8 million. So it was just a matter of time before they ground the Germans down.
Mm-hmm.
And, but, they had, I'm just trying to think, I'm not an expert on that. I know that they would launch major attacks, but they did have the manpower to do that.
Mm-hmm.
When you could think of the war in Western Europe, the Americans and the British, I think at the height of the war, there was something like 1.5 million Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, 1.5 million Americans, how many of them were actually in the infantry? Not that many.
Mm-hmm.
Probably maybe hundreds, couple 100,000. And the Germans, the Russians had tens of thousands of men that they could pour into the German lines. In fact, one of the things the Russians had were penal battalions, guys who otherwise might have been shot or put in prison were at the point of the attack. Oh. And when they got cut down, everybody else came following through. And I don't know how true it is, but if they didn't have enough rifles, the guys coming in behind would pick up a rifle of somebody who'd been shot down and keep on going. Mm-hmm. So I think it was I would say that it was a combination of both overpowering and kind of a broad front, but also some spectacular, knife-like thrust to cut off. They cut off whole German armies and surrounded them.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn to how you did the research for this book. What archives did you use, and what sort of materials?
National Archives is obviously a very good source. Mm-hmm. I would go down there and check out the various divisions, like the 28th Division. One of my great sources was called it's called Fold 3, mm-hmm. And they have an archive of after the war, the Americans interviewed many German generals, mm-hmm. And they transcribed all these, and so they have this archive of interviews with German generals, and I probably read about 30 or 40 of those from generals, particularly relating to what they thought about the American attacks and whether they would prevail. And of course, interestingly enough, many of them said the Americans just failed to follow through with their attacks. If they had followed through, they would have, maybe ended the war sooner. So Fold 3 was a major source. The internet is just an amazing source. If you just keep stabbing away, you come across material that you never expected to find. Mm-hmm. Plus, many of the well-known histories of the war, John Keegan, although he didn't get too much into that. Mm-hmm. You read Patton's book, Bradley's book, all of these. So you put it all together. Much of this information is basically known. Mm-hmm. Fighting at Aachen, Wallendorf, you can read about it. Mm-hmm. And for example, the situation with Devers, 6th Army Group crossing the Rhine, the Army Green Book, or what I call the Green Book's history of that area, invasion of southern France, goes into about a 5 or 10 page discussion about, had Eisenhower allowed Devers to cross, what might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an American general, I'm trying to think what his name was. I want to say Quinn, but I'm not sure that's who it was. He was the engineer for 7th Army or 6th Army Group. And he wrote a treatise and said, it was the dumbest thing that he could think of is for Eisenhower not to let Devers go across the Rhine. Mm-hmm. And because he felt that they had worked it out, they had the resources, the defense across the Rhine was nothing. And so that's about a 10-page, and that kind of set me off on researching that area in Alsace and Devers' 6th Army Group.
Mm-hmm. So what, for the research for this book, what was the most surprising thing you came across?
I guess, I wrote that down. I can't remember what I said, but I think the thing that surprises me most, as I mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. that there are many histories of the war. And the first histories were laid down by some of the generals, many of the generals, and also some of the reporters. One of them is Chester Wilmot. Okay. I forget the name of the book, but he covered the war, and he wrote one of the first histories. But I think the problem is that somebody decides to write about World War II, so they go back to the standard texts on World War II, and they see something like Wallendorf or Belfort, and they accept the word of previous historians mm-hmm. that the American Army didn't have the resources to pursue Wallendorf or even Belfort, when in fact they did, if they wanted to employ them properly. Mm-hmm. So it surprises me that, 80 years after the war, there isn't more, and I don't want to sound arrogant, but more, profound study mm-hmm. of the situation, of the military situation in Europe. In fact, you can read PhD and master's theses of officers at the War College mm-hmm. and other places. And it's surprising how lacking in depth some of these theses are. They're basically following the history that they read in history books, but they don't explore beyond what they can pick up and your standard histories.
Mm-hmm. Was there a question in this research for this book, was there a question you really had a difficult time getting an answer for that you wanted, and either you did or it's still an open question and you'd love to know the answer?
One of them, I'm just trying to think. One of them dealt with Patton, mm-hmm. And basically the chapter I wrote on Patton. I've never been a tremendous fan of Patton. I think he's overplayed. In North Africa, he was in command for about 3 weeks before he was redirected to plan the invasion of Sicily. Mm-hmm. In Sicily, his army was not fighting the major units of the German army. The British went up the east coast, and the Germans were fighting. That's where the Germans expected them to attack. But Patton was charging up through central Sicily when there was virtually no, opposition. Mm-hmm. And in France, he was considered by the Germans to be the best American general, but he didn't run into a great amount of resistance in the attack across France. And the German army was falling apart, and it was really nothing more than rabble. Mm-hmm. So, and this situation with gas, Patton saying, if I'd had the gas, I would have broken through the German defenses and ended the war. So when you try to piece together all of the studies about this, did he not get enough gas? And we're talking August 30th or something. He's 44. He's complaining he doesn't have any gas.
Mhm.
Well, by the September 4th, he has a lot of gasoline. And he admits that he's captured a huge store of German gasoline. It was for poor quality,
Mhm.
but it still kept his tanks going. According to in his book, or in his letters, his diary, he says he captured over 1 million gallons.
Mhm.
And Bradley says in his book that Patton captured more than 1 million gallons. Well, somehow it translates down into he captured 110,000 gallons. So the question is, what is the truth? Patton was not averse to lying to get more gas. He had guys out, waylaying Red Ball, convoys full of gas that were supposed to go to First Army
Mhm.
and ship them to Third Army. And the other thing is, it's never quite pointed out that the Germans were afraid of Patton, so therefore they stacked their lines opposite Third Army, and so that it was much more difficult for Patton to. He never did really break through as he wanted to do. Now, is that because the Germans are stopping him? I think that he gets a lot more credit than he should get. And compared to some of the other generals, I mean, one guy who I'd like to know more about is Fourth Armored Division, P. Wood,
Mhm.
John Wood, who is, he didn't take any gaff from Patton, talked back to him, and argued with him, and in many cases he was right. He wanted to break out of Brittany and head towards the German frontier, and Patton told him no.
Mhm.
And so Patton is. I'd love to do more research on Patton, and but other than that, there weren't too many surprises.
It seems that if he's stealing a lot of gas from his own people, he might claim, "Hey, I got this. I captured this from the Germans. I didn't get it from anywhere else."
He might have. There was a fair amount of theft going on.
Mhm. Yeah. So, was there anything you came across that had a strong emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
Not really, I don't think. I guess, well, yes, I would say the one thing that I really couldn't quite figure out is this whole market garden situation. The idea that you know I know that the generals in Washington, Marshall for one, and Arnold, General Arnold, who was head of the Air Force, were concerned that you had these airborne divisions sitting in England
Mhm.
and they weren't being used. And so Marshall and Arnold wanted to get these guys into action. And all across France, they dropped into Normandy on D-Day, some of them. And then they went back to England to wait. And they were called, to be ready to drop about 4 or 5 times as the Allies advanced across France.
Mhm.
But because the ground forces got to the objective quicker than they expected, the airborne divisions didn't get into action. So
Mhm.
there was this pressure to make use of the airborne divisions, and that's what kind of spawned the planning for Market Garden. And it was, kind of like one day they say let's attack, and the next day they're planning it, and they've got about 7 days to do it. And a lot of it, I know General Gavin was aghast at the fact that the British Airborne Division was being dropped 7 miles from the target of the Arnhem Bridge. And he just said, that's ridiculous. He said, I can't believe this. And then there was Major Euchert, who was the intelligence officer who kept warning the British generals that, hey, you're going to run into a hornet's nest.
Mhm.
And just the planning was really, really poor. And I think it was pushed to get the airborne divisions into play to satisfy Montgomery, who wanted to have this deep thrust into Germany.
Mhm.
And it obviously turned out poorly. You can't, the other thing is they advanced up this lone road with marsh on all sides so that you couldn't spread out. The tanks had to follow this lone road. So there was much that was really poorly planned, unprofessional, and but as Major Euchert pointed out, once the wheels started turning, everybody was backing it, and turned out to be terrible.
Though I think earlier, didn't you say that with a little more use of reserves, it might have succeeded? Were you talking about Market Garden?
Well, that was one of the things. I believe it was Gavin. Oh no, it was Smith. Beetle Smith was very concerned about what he saw as the planning for Market Garden, and he went to Montgomery and said, "Get another airborne division." I'm not sure which one he had in mind, but get another airborne division to bolster the attacks. And Montgomery said, "Well, it wasn't necessary." So that's one area. I don't know whether reserves would have helped that, because you had the whole 30 Corps, British 30 Corps, attacking from the Netherlands, and they had to confine that attack up this narrow road. Yeah, presumably they could have used more reserves, but I think the basic problem was just too hasty planning and poor planning. I mean, for instance, they couldn't drop the airborne division, the first airborne division, on the near the bridge, because one side was too marshy and the other side was urban. So they chose this area 7 miles away, and one of the things they did, they landed without the proper radios, and they knew that the radios weren't working properly even in North Africa, but no one thought to change to make sure that there were adequate radios, so these guys couldn't communicate.
Have you been able to visit many of the sites that you discuss in the book, the battle site?
Yeah, I've been to Arnhem and explored all over the area around Wallendorf, and I'm trying to think. Been to the Aachen. Yeah, I've been to Aachen, and in Italy, I've been to Belfort, that area. Yeah, Belfort and Alsace. In Italy, I was in most of those places. Sicily, I've been to Sicily numerous times. The place, I'm trying to think of the hill, the monastery in Italy that stopped everybody. Anyway, I can't pull up the name right now. And when I was a kid, my family lived in Europe right after the war, and so I saw many of these places that were severely damaged. Monte Cassino. I remember Monte Cassino in 1952. I was 11 or 12, and the place was it was just rubble. And then a couple of number of years later, my wife and I went back in the 70s, and I climbed Monte Cassino, and it had burned it off, so there wasn't much vegetation on it. And I could stand down as I walked up, and I could see various areas where the Germans, like a little flat area, maybe 10, 15 feet up, where the Germans might have had a foxhole or something. So I'd go up there, and on 2 occasions, I get up to this little platform, and I can see a depression where there was a foxhole, and in front of the foxhole were these corroded potato masher hand grenades. And the hillside was littered with chunks of iron. I remember finding a piece of boot. So yeah, I've been to a number of these places, and I keep going back, checking things out. I was at Normandy 15 years after the invasion there, and there's still tons of debris, big stuff, the harbor, chunks of cement, and the pillboxes hadn't been beautified. You'd see a German pillbox, and there were scores, if not hundreds, probably scores of shells embedded in the concrete that hadn't exploded. If you go back there today, that's all beautified cement cemented over.
Mm-hmm. So, what part of this research for this particular book did you find most enjoyable?
I think just generally finding that, boy, if pursuing these attacks of Wallendorf and I mean, for example, I spoke to a guy he was a major in the American Army, and he was involved in NATO planning. And I talked to him about this about 10 years ago. And I said, what did he think about Wallendorf as a, Germans, where the Americans are attacking? He said, oh, that was a terrible place to attack because of these bluffs, the bluffs that rise up. Well, I went to Wallendorf, and, you call them bluffs. They're just, it's kind of like a, land rising up to a plateau.
Mm-hmm.
And not maybe a couple of 100 feet, but it's not a sharp grade, and there's a couple of roads that go up. Well, the Americans got into Wallendorf very quickly and went right up over this so-called bluff,
Mm-hmm.
and had no trouble. Or they did have some trouble when they got up on the plateau, which has a lot of ravines in it. But yeah, that was surprising, and just finding out that why hasn't more research been done to go beyond just the historical facts that are presented
Mm-hmm.
in many of the common histories.
So, did you have any trouble getting this book finished or published?
That's an interesting story, because I was writing this mainly for myself. I'm working on a number of other projects,
Mm-hmm.
and but I felt strongly enough about it that I wanted to finish it. And I think I could probably go back and continue research and maybe add to it. But so I sent it off to my agent, just thinking, well, I finished it. I don't give it much of a chance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he did either. There was a little bit of a concern, but he sent it off. He sent it off once or twice. He sent it to Casemate, and lo and behold, he called me up and said, they're buying it. And I was tickled pink, because I really didn't think that this was something that a publisher would be interested in. For one, it is a kind of an attack, if you want to call it that, on Eisenhower and the Allied command.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt that it was important to point this out. And so it's published.
So, if it hadn't been published, were you considering breaking it up into magazine articles or anything like that?
Possibly, yeah. I could have done that.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to write a lot of articles, magazine articles. I've written for VFW, Army Magazine, mechanical engineering on some of the military subjects.
Mm-hmm.
But right now I'm focusing more on books,
Mm-hmm.
and they keep me busy. I work every morning writing for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, and most of it's military history.
So, what's your current or future writing projects that you might want to mention?
Well, two things. One that the more I think about it kind of fascinates me is the use of Germans' use of jets,
Mm-hmm.
fighters, and the point that the Germans had these Me-162s or whatever it was, well, fairly early in the war, and they were a twin-engine fighter, basically a twin-engine fighter. And Hitler refused to allow them to be used as fighters and wanted them turned into bombers. And so they were equipped as bombers. And Adolf Galland, who was the head of the German fighter division, wanted them used as fighters. Well, towards the end of the war, they finally, I think by the summer of 44, they started to catch on. And these planes were used as fighters, and they would go after the bomber formations. And it scared the daylights out of the Allies, particularly the Americans, because these things were really fast. and they had 37 millimeter cannons. So if you got hit by them, it'd probably destroy the plane in one shot. But I remember talking to a veteran, Air Force veteran years ago, who was a ball turret gunner, the top ball turret gunner right behind the cockpit. And he said the problem that the Americans had, one problem was these planes were so fast, and the guns, the turret guns, wouldn't operate fast enough. They couldn't follow the fighters as they streamed by. And I know that the Air Force had to devise new tactics to fight these German fighters. They would try to round them up, like almost like a herd them. Two planes would go out, and one would try to force the jet to turn, and the other plane would be swooping down, waiting for the German jet to pass in front of them. And that was the tactic they were trying to use. But it really concerned the Americans. And the question is, how far advanced was the American, was the technology, the jet technology of the Americans? I know they had a jet was developed and flew in 1942, but it was really not worth much. And then the P-80, which became the F-80, was developed in the war, was actually used just briefly in Italy, I think more for training, check out the specifications and how it operated. And the Germans could not produce enough of these jets to do serious harm to the Americans. So the question is, how did the Americans operate? How did they reflect on this? And the British had Meteor jets, but they wouldn't fly them over Germany because they didn't want the Germans to get the technology. So they would only use them in air defense and on ground attack. But the Meteors were flying in 44. So the question is, could the Allies have responded quickly to the German jets had they been forced to? And there must be a lot of information about this in the Air Force archives about how the generals must have been really upset trying to figure out how to deal with this. And could we have responded fast enough with, say, our P-80s to get them into action? So I'm kind of, working on that subject is kind of a fascinating subject. And the other one is the proximity fuse, developing some kind of story around the proximity fuse, which is the fuse that was fired before the proximity fuse. The gunners had to set the fuses. So if the planes were flying at 10,000 feet, they'd set the fuse to go off at 10,000 feet and hope that it was close enough to explode at 10,000 feet and destroy an aircraft. Proximity fuse had a little radio transmitter in it. I mean, it's fascinating to think back then when, without the technology of today, that they would fit a little transmitter in the head of a artillery shell, which would transmit radio waves at the target, and the radio waves would bounce back, and at a prescribed point, it would explode the shell. So that if you wanted to knock a plane down, you would shoot at it, and the shell would go off in proximity to the airplane and damage it or destroy it. And that, this was a highly secret, situation. British were developing it, and they gave it to the Americans to develop, and we developed it. And they seldom used it because they were afraid that the Germans, they didn't use it over Germany until the Battle of the Bulge. And they were afraid that the Germans would get the technology, which would be very destructive to the Allied air assaults. They used it in the Pacific because if it was a dud, it would fall into the water. So they used it against the German forces in the Battle of the Bulge. And I guess it must have been set to go off at a certain level just before the ground. So it would come in and explode, say maybe 10, 15 feet above the ground, and it would just devastate German infantry units.
Do you know if the first book you talked about that you're working on, do you know if Operation Paperclip was that at all geared towards getting the jet technology?
That I don't know. That's
I think
interesting. I'll have to check that. What is that? You
I
know?
think it's called Paperclip. That's the one where the Americans got the Nazi scientists and smuggled them.
Oh, you mean after the war?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, I haven't gotten into that. I know they got Werner von Braun
Hmm.
and the rocket scientists. Of course, the Russians got some too. So
Right.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, exactly that one. I wonder if it had how much jet technology was also a concern.
Trying to think. There was this when the Americans captured Strasbourg, they sent in a team because they were concerned the Germans were, yeah, the Germans were developing. They thought the Germans were developing atomic, you know,
uh,
bombs. Some of the technology was taking place at the University of Strasbourg.
hmm,
And now that you mentioned it, I think at the same time they captured a German jet engine,
hmm,
but I'm not positive. And so that was, I don't know whether that was by accident or by design that they went in. They went into some factory, whether that was actually in Strasbourg or later, I'm not sure. But they did capture some jet technology.
hmm. So with this book, The Folly of Generals, what do you hope readers will take away from it? You've mentioned a few things, but if you want to expand on that.
Well, I guess to look at World War II in a different light, it kind of, I forget what you would call it, uh, the just a different perspective on the whole situation. That we read um, about the war, and so much of it is the same thing over and over again. And some of these books that are coming out, I don't want to mention any names, but they're beautifully researched and written. But it's pretty much the same.
Mhm.
I mean, one recent history. It's interesting. He has Eisenhower in his car, smoking and doing things that you wouldn't. There was no way he would know. He had this author had to kind of put himself in Eisenhower's position, and so it reads kind of like a novel,
Mhm.
and interesting anecdotes
Mhm.
that haven't about personalities, things like that. But as I mentioned earlier, in this particular book that I'm describing, um, when it comes to the question of the attack into Belfort, he calls it a dubious situation. So it's too bad that General Trescott isn't around to counter that.
Mhm.
But yeah, just to take a different look at World War II and some of the possibilities that are seldom mentioned.
Mhm. Do you have any social media online presence, like social media website for people to follow your?
Yeah, I have a website, and I put it on. I should get involved in social media. I was at one time, and somebody hacked my Facebook uh, program, and so I haven't gone back in. But yeah, I'm thinking about that seriously. Some of the other social media sources, but I do have a website which is davidpcolley.com,
Mhm.
and I list all of my books and articles and so forth.
Okay, so that's David P. and then Colley is COLLEY.com.
.com.
Okay, okay. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm kind of talked out.
Uh,
I have to keep drinking water.
yeah.
No, I just say thank you very much for having me. And
I learned a lot of interesting things here, so I'm definitely curious to pick up the book and read it and see what you have to say. But thank you for speaking with me.
thank you for having me.
Coming soon, historic battle summaries put to music traditional to the war's time period. Available on Amazon audiobooks and at warscholar.org. First up, the major battles of the American Revolution. Thank you for watching this video version of Military History Inside Out. For more historian interviews, please find Military History Inside Out at your favorite podcast provider or visit warscholar.org. We are also on Instagram at Cris Alvarez War Scholar, on X at War Scholar, and on Facebook at warscholar.org. Visit warscholar.org for more social media links and for military history related books and items for sale. Please check back regularly for more episodes and provide likes and subscribe where you can to support continued production of these episodes. Thank you for listening.